Here's Dinesh D'Souza to be embarrassingly wrong about the scientific accuracy of the Bible.
Let me ask you something.
If you've got something to ask.
Let me turn around and ask you questions in a sort of what I think is a more fundamental mode, because it gets to what the Bible really is.
Let's hear it.
Do you think that the universe had a beginning?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I would suspect yes.
You suspect yes?
Yeah, sure.
How did the writers of the book of Genesis know that?
Lucky guess? Is that really all that more far-fetched than divine inspiration?
I have no idea. It could, I mean, if I'm
You
going to
think
be
they guessed?
if I'm going to be cynical about this, if they did guess, it would be a 50-50 guess. And I also think that if we had scientific...
Would it be a 50-50 guess?
What other options would there be? The universe has either been around forever or it hasn't. Unless there is some reason to infer that the universe being around forever is somehow more probable, I don't see why it wouldn't be a 50-50 guess.
Yeah, because, and it might even be worse than that for you, because if we had some kind of scientific popular hypothesis, because of course the Big Bang might not have been the beginning of everything, who knows, right? But like, whatever the popular scientific hypothesis is, if it were pointing to an infinite universe, for example, as Einstein thought we lived in, then I'm sure that people would open Genesis. They would say that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and say that the earth just means the earth itself, right? Like, I think it would be equally easily interpretable on either account.
How are we to interpret the heavens? Does that mean all of space and time? As Dan McClellan has pointed out, in the beginning isn't even the best translation. A better translation would be when God began creating the heavens and the earth. That sounds much less like it implies the beginning of all of space and time.
So if we were to translate it very literally from the Hebrew, it would be an incomplete sentence. It would be a temporal clause that literally said, in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth. More idiomatically in English, we would render when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And then verses 2 and 3 would finish the sentence by describing the state of affairs. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was empty and desolate, and the Spirit of God was moving over the abyss or over the depths. So this is not creation ex nihilo. This is describing the state of affairs when God began their creative process. And the scholarly consensus is that creation ex nihilo was not developed until the 2nd century CE, and towards the end of the 2nd century CE, as Christian apologists were debating the morality of eternal matter and the nature of the resurrection with Gnostics and with other Greco-Roman thinkers.
The beginning is not an absolute beginning of space-time, but rather the beginning of the process of creating the heavens and the earth.
All right. So one of my professors at Dartmouth was Robert Jastrow. He headed the Mount Wilson Laboratory, one of the great astronomers of the 20th century.
Sure.
So Jastrow writes in his book, God and the Astronomers, that for 250 years, modern science has been attempting to discover whether the universe had a beginning. Mm-hmm. And you can think of these scientists as ascending a very tall mountain in which there are many pathways. And for many years, with the steady state hypothesis and so on, there were beliefs that the universe was eternal. It never had a beginning. In fact, that was the prevailing point of view. And then Jastrow argues it's almost as if we reached the top of the mountain and there was a bunch of Hebrew prophets or theologians sitting there who had been there from the beginning.
Yeah, it took a long time to demonstrate whether the universe had a beginning or not. That doesn't mean that it's wildly improbable for someone to guess that it did have a beginning.
So I'm describing now a skeptic, a true skeptic and a true scientist describing the scientific shock that attends to a discovery that, and I think it is out of the spirit of that discovery for you to go, oh yeah, I mean, it could have been this. It's like tossing a coin. It isn't like tossing a coin. This is a question that's been argued for 2 centuries and only resolved in the last several decades.
The fact that proving whether the universe had a beginning or not is not like tossing a coin doesn't mean that guessing whether it had a beginning or not is not like tossing a coin.
And resolved decisively in one side and the other, and the fact that you're not willing to just straight out say, yeah, it is actually an astounding fact that we now know.
No. I mean, look, the scientific method has also revealed to us that the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. That is much later than the sun. The Old Testament account, the Hebrew Bible account, tells us that it was the other way around. So it got that bit wrong.
All of a sudden, Dinesh is questioning whether the authors of Genesis really had any miraculous insight into the cosmology of the universe.
All right. So we're yes. The Bible is not.
So sometimes it gets things right.
No.
Sometimes it gets things wrong. You know.
The Bible is not a
not that
science.
astounding to me.
It's not listing out a scientific.
Well, now hold on a second. You can't now move the goalpost, especially if you're still gonna miss.
Of course, Dinesh doesn't want to concede that the authors of Genesis were not given divine crib notes about cosmology. So when the Bible gets cosmology right, it's evidence of divine inspiration, and when it gets something wrong, well, you know, it's not intended to be a science textbook, so, like, whatever, man.
The issue, the issue of the origin of the universe is extremely critical.
You just told me that Genesis predicted, or knew about, or somehow knew about, the scientific hypothesis of the origin of the universe. Then when I pointed out another scientific observation that doesn't accord with Genesis, you tell me that Genesis isn't a scientific text to begin with.
Well, if you read Genesis, it is making a astounding claim which pertains to God.
I'm still not convinced that saying that the universe had a beginning is all that astounding a claim. And again, it's not even really making that claim. If you consider the meaning of the original Hebrew, it looks like it's just talking about the beginning of God's act of creating stuff, not the beginning of all of space-time.
Obviously, God created the heavens and the earth.
Is it making a scientific claim or not? Is it telling us how the universe scientifically formed or not?
It's not telling us how the universe scientifically formed, because if it did, they would be outlining the history of the Big Bang.
Then what's the relevance of bringing this up in the first place?
Because it is stating a conclusion, not a process. It's not telling you how the universe was formed.
Right. Genesis gives a timeline of what was created on what day. That does sound like the description of a process to me, and it gets the process wrong. Why would God inspire the authors to be accurate about the conclusion, but not accurate about the order of events? What's the point of that?
It's not telling you about...
It also doesn't tell us how the sun was formed, but it tells us that it was formed after the earth was. It tells us that that's the case. That's wrong. It's incorrect.
Show me.
I don't have a Bible.
Okay.
For the record, Genesis says that the earth was created on the first day, and the sun, moon, and stars were created on the fourth day. Interestingly, God also created light on the first day, 3 days before the sun and stars were created. Where was that light coming from? Magic, I guess.
Well, I've read that passage maybe a dozen times. I have never spotted this contradiction that you're describing. But I'll go back and look at it again. But again...
On what day is it that God makes the sun? And day 4? Is day 3 or day 4, something around there?
You're right, but
when's
the
light
mainstream
created?
of the Christian tradition does...
When's
It obviously
the earth
can't
created?
be day 4 because the concept of day in the original Hebrew doesn't mean day.
Sure, but day 4 comes after day 1, right?
Well, it's describing obviously epochs or periods.
Yeah,
yes.
so actually it's much worse, because now the sun is created much later than the earth was.
Well, not necessarily.
Some folks who insist that the Bible is scientifically accurate want to have their cake and eat it too. The ones who don't totally discard contemporary science will wave away clear inaccuracies as not being intended as literal. I suspect that this is what Dinesh has in mind.
Well, show me.
I don't know. I mean, we can read through that. We can find Genesis.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if that would be the best use of our time.
Dinesh, you already asked him to show you, and he already said that he didn't have a Bible on him.
I mean, we can do it if you really want to, but what I'm trying to say is that, like, it's not astonishing.
Let's move on.
Let's just stop talking about this thing that undermines my point.
Why not? It's not astonishing to me that like if you're making claims about the origin of the universe, especially in the case where if it is making a specific claim in the knowledge that there's a sort of infinite hypothesis and a beginning hypothesis, to take a 50-50 stab, it's not amazing to me. It would be more amazing to me if everything lined up and it gave us an otherwise unknowable historical scientific account of the beginning of the universe. But as you say, that's not even what Genesis is trying to do.
Well, he seems inconsistent with respect to what he wants us to believe Genesis is trying to do. When it says things that appear to line up with science, it's trying to tell us scientifically accurate things, and wow, is that ever a miracle? When it says things that are clearly contradicted by the scientific evidence, then that's just because it's not really trying to be scientifically accurate. How convenient.
So I don't. In other words, I don't understand how this.
Yeah, I'm not saying that Genesis is trying to unfurl I'm saying that Genesis is making a statement about creation, and the statement about creation has a very startling scientific implication.
It says several things about creation that have several scientific implications. Some of them seem to line up with what the evidence shows, and some of them are flatly contradicted by the evidence.
Because if there was a creation, then there obviously wasn't something, and then there was something.
That's why the idea that the space-time continuum was created doesn't really make sense in the first place. Without space or time, there was no there, and there was no was. The universe cannot coherently be said to have been created out of nothing because there never was nothing. There was never a time or place when there was no time or space. This is true by definition.
I mean, it's not just science which can tell us that the universe had a beginning. I mean, like, there are lots of philosophical arguments that people have made, perhaps most famously Al-Ghazali, who argues against for the impossibility of a past infinite universe, and I think does so quite convincingly, with no reference to redshifting and no reference to scientific hypotheses. So it's perfectly possible for somebody to take a pretty studious and educated guess at the fact that the universe had a beginning.
Yeah, no shockingly miraculous revelations are necessary in order to come to the conclusion that the universe has not been around for an infinite amount of time.
Long before the scientific method told us that that was the case.
I'm not saying that it's not possible to make philosophical arguments, and of course, as you know, there was a tradition in ancient Greece of making philosophical arguments all over the place.
So maybe that's why
let me keep going. It's my time. Let me pose questions.
I'm trying to answer your question.
Let me change the subject now that you have me backed into a corner.
Maybe if you ask me how would they know, isn't this astounding? I would say, well, maybe they just had a philosophical tradition that taught a beginning of the universe, and that's where they got it from.
Except that
it's not inconceivable.
It's not inconceivable, but it's not likely, because when we think of the tradition of Western civilization, we speak of Athens and Jerusalem. We speak of the origins of philosophy starting in about the 8th century BCE, and then really developing first in Greece.
In other words, they were just too ignorant to have even made the guess that the universe had a beginning. Therefore, the most likely explanation for Genesis 1:1 is that the authors were informed about the Big Bang by a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind. This is what Dinesh would like us to believe. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.